We live in America, the land of freedom and justice for all. A country where we're all supposed to be treated equally, regardless of our race, our religion, or our sexual orientation. So what would you say if I told you that you could still be fired in certain states for being gay or trans? What if I told you this was true in 30 states today? So we won marriage equality a couple of years ago. Imagine if I got married this weekend and went back into work with my wedding band on Monday. People would probably be a little bit confused and say to me, Tara, congratulations, we can't believe you got married. Who's the lucky man? What should I say to them? I would have to make a decision about either going along and telling them that I had married a man and making up a name or something, or telling them that I'd married a woman and then facing possibly being fired or facing discrimination at work. So not surprisingly, a 2014 study found that over half of LGBTQ workers in the US are not out at work. Before I continue, I want to take a second to define some of the terms I'll be using for the rest of this talk. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the acronym LGBTQAA, can sometimes get a little bit long, and that generally stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, asexual, and allies. And I want to make sure I'm not leaving any terms out, so I like to use the words queer for sexual minorities, so people who are lesbians, bisexual, trans for gender minorities, so anyone who is transgender or non-binary. And then a really important word is allies. So allies are anyone who is a supporter of the cause. So in this case, people who believe in equal rights for queer and trans people and who are willing to speak up and defend us. How does inclusivity come into play in the workplace? I think now most of you guys probably know this, that diversity is crucial to innovation, which is why it's really important that all of us are engineers. And it's important that any industry has a diverse group of people. In engineering especially, it's mainly been driven by straight white men. So the minute you get anyone into the room who's not one of those people, you get a new creative mindset that's approaching those problems. You get more creative ideas coming out and more innovative products. The thing is, if we get those people in the room, we also have to make sure that we're keeping them and that they feel comfortable and they can do their best work. And that's when an inclusive culture comes in. So this is especially true nowadays that I know I thought coming into work that I was going to have like my work personality and my personal personality, that I wasn't going to be able to be open about my personal life at work. But as many of you know, I think like I'm often part of conversations where Dave's talking about his wife's due date for their pregnancy, or Susan's talking about how her and her husband are dealing with their daughter's new nut allergy. We recently had an engineer, Anne, who joined, who every Monday would talk about her Tinder dating experience. And I really wanted to join that conversation, but I was nervous because I was seeing people of all genders on the app, and I didn't know what she would think if I told her this. So I was lucky that I told her, and she was super cool about it. But the thing is, when those conversations come up, if you're queer or trans, you have to face this decision. Do you join in and are you open about your personal life, or do you stay closeted? And if you stay closeted, you're safe in some ways, but that means that you're kind of self-segregating yourself out of that workplace culture. And that can matter when people are grabbing drinks and you're not invited because you're not really part of those conversations. Maybe someone's bringing up a project at work where they need a new engineer on it, and you don't get to be there to tell them that you want to take on that role. And then the thing is, on the other hand, if you do come out, you can face overt discrimination. In 30 states, you could literally be fired. And also there's a lot of this subtle discrimination. That's what I see more now. So I live in Rhode Island where I am protected legally, but I noticed that if I mention that I'm queer, or like if I talk about giving this talk at this conference, people might be a little bit uncomfortable with it. And that can seem kind of innocent, but it can come up then if people are talking about who to promote. People may not see me as someone who they would imagine as a senior engineer. They may not see me as someone they want on their project team, someone who can really contribute. And I think as women engineers, you often find that most people you work with probably would say they treat you as, or they see you as an equal, but that may not always be true in their actions. So that can happen a lot if you end up coming out at work. There are things we can do though. So I think one of the most important things is to speak up. And you can speak up in two different ways at your work. One is more on a social level, and then one is more on the company policy level. So to start out with, speaking up at the social level, I would say if you are queer or trans and you feel comfortable doing this, it's really important to be open. I think I'm also a woman of color, so at work, that's something that I can't hide. I'm automatically always out as being a person of color and being a woman. And for a lot of people I work with, I'm the first woman engineer they've worked with. I'm the first person of color who's an engineer, and probably the first queer woman of color who's an engineer that they've ever interacted with. So just by being in the workplace, I'm giving them a face to all of these groups and giving them some more familiarity with them. Back in college in my freshman year, this woman Sam lived on my floor, and I knew that she was very religious. And unfortunately, part of her religion was that she thought that all people who were gay or trans were going to go to hell. So at the time I was dating a woman, and anytime she'd come up, I noticed that Sam would politely leave the room, or if I talked about my girlfriend, she would like kind of change the subject or exit the conversation. But she was so nice about it, I never knew how to talk to her about it, and I felt really uncomfortable bringing it up. But I was really fortunate that a few years later I caught up with her, and she told me that just being my friend and seeing what a good friend I was to her and a good partner to my girlfriend, that really changed how she perceived her religion. And it was pretty incredible, but she ended up finding a more accepting way to continue to follow her religion. And also this idea about speaking up is really important for allies as well as people who are queer or trans. Sometimes it can be scary for us to speak up. So if you're an ally and you care about the cause, maybe you can, if you hear someone making a joke that is homophobic or transphobic, or making a comment that's bigoted, you can jump in there and talk to them in a way that maybe they'll feel more safe talking to you about, because they're not, like I think for me, if I bring something up, they may be a little bit more scared about insulting me or making me feel uncomfortable, but if you're an ally, you can come to them from a place that they'll understand a bit better. So for me, all I can do really is change the environment at my one company, but there's some of us that have the power to do it on a much larger scale. Many of you may know Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. I interned for Apple a while back, and at the time, I knew that he was gay. I feel like everyone kind of knew, but he wasn't out for some reason publicly. So that made me wonder, like, it was California, so you'd think it would be a liberal state, but I was worried about being out at work. And I generally didn't fit into my work team, which may have been for a variety of reasons, but I think one part was that I felt kind of like awkward talking about my personal life at work. And then I think it really held me back with the other interns. I was nervous to come out to my roommates, and that meant that I couldn't participate in a lot of our conversations. Luckily, a few years later, Tim did come out, and I think that was incredible. It was such a game-changing moment. As someone who's queer, for me, all of a sudden, I got this role model who is the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the entire world. And I think a lot of parents of queer or trans kids may have trouble accepting their child, being worried about what their future is going to look like, and then all of a sudden they got this really incredible potential future for their children. And as important as it is to speak up at work, it's equally as important to make sure you're speaking up about your company policy. So I think the first thing you should do is educate yourself on what those policies are. So figure out, are you in a state where queer and trans people are protected, and whether that's from discrimination or also in healthcare benefits, things like that. And then figure out what your company's individual policies are. So some big companies like Walmart, Google, General Electric, they have their own anti-discrimination policies where they state who is protected. So usually that's race, religion, but then they also have included sexual identity or just sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's something that your office can do regardless of what state you're in, and especially if you're a company that exists across the nation and the world. Another thing is healthcare benefits for trans people are protected in like a handful of states. So that's a huge thing that your company can do, is making sure they're choosing a healthcare package that is going to cover all of their employees. There also are a lot of smaller changes that you can make, and these may depend on who your employees are and what your company culture is like. So some examples would be having private one-person bathrooms at work. So those could be targeted towards people who feel uncomfortable using male or female bathrooms, but I think I speak for everyone here when I say that I would not mind having more private bathrooms at work. There also are non-birthing parental leave policies. So that could be important in the context of a parental couple where neither of them is having the child if they're adopting, which can sometimes happen if it's a queer or trans couple. But that's also important for heterosexual couples if both parents want to play an equal role in those first weeks of life for their child. And then the next thing is, how do you make those changes? So if you're in an HR or leadership position, it might be much more obvious how you could do that. But if you're a regular employee like me who just wants to make your workplace a little more inclusive, it can seem very intimidating. And I found that first you can find an ally who is in a position to make those changes. So for me, we hired in a new executive VP who was our first female executive VP, and I immediately targeted her. I was hoping that because she was a woman and she comes from an engineering background that she would care about this kind of stuff, and I'm lucky that she does. So I would say just try to seek people out. You can ask them if they want to grab coffee, say you're looking for a mentor relationship, and then once you're starting that relationship, you can feel out if there's someone that's going to be responsive to the things you want to bring up. And then next you can bring up what the policies are that you've researched so well, and what you'd want to see changed in your workplace. So although we have come a very long way in this fight for equality, we still obviously have a very long way to go. I only found out about this, the fact that we can be fired in 30 states, when I was researching for this talk. So I was thinking, like, the first 8 years that I was out, I thought I'd have to choose where I worked when I grew up based on where I could marry the person that I loved. And now I found out that I can get married, but I just can't tell anyone about it if I live in 30 states in this country. So engineering also has mainly been run by straight white men. So as I said earlier, it's really important that if we want to have more diversity and be more innovative in this industry, we need to make sure that we need to get people into the industry who are more diverse, and then we need to make sure that we're keeping them there. Thank you all for listening to me today. I'd like to leave you with one thought, which is that we all have the power to make change if we speak up about it. Thanks. And now I'll take questions.